who has some victory in codependency and is working on some other issues as God brings them up. I have the pleasure of being with you today as Daniel gets some much needed R&R time. Welcome to Recovering Hope. Recovering Hope is the name that we chose to call it during this time of uncertainty because we wanted to have the lessons and the teachings readily available to everyone and anyone who may need it. During this season, we have faced many trials, and everyone has been stretched in ways they have never been stretched before. Our normal, as people like to say, is different for everyone during these times. We are all in need of some kind of recovery. We like to say in Celebrate Recovery, or CR, this is your ministry. Everyone wrestles with hurts, habits, and hang-ups that get in the way of our personal relationship with Jesus. At the core of all our issues, at the root, at the foundation of it all, is a trusting God issue. This is what we all have in common. Now, I'm not sure if you have or if you ever will join us live in person, sitting in these seats at our CR meetings. They will be resuming in person very soon, July 6th. Hey! All right. But my hope for you and everyone who's listening today is they can take a piece from this and a deep sense of hope, restoration, and peace. That you can leave with a sense of encouragement and a realization that God is real in our lives and he can change everything if you allow him to. Each week in CR, we have either a teaching or a testimony. And this week, as you've heard, is a testimony. Please join us next week as we will have a teaching. The teachings during this time are in sync with our messages on Sunday at Venture Church. I'm excited to hear more on the new series we have at Venture, At the Movies, and how it ties into our recovery. The following weeks, we have a testimony, like tonight. Every testimony is different, but all share in the redemption of Jesus Christ. God is our Redeemer. Although this is not your story, I encourage you to listen with an open heart and mind. Lean in and hear how God really is in your own life. God's power works differently in each of our lives. We can choose to focus on the differences or embrace all the similarities we have in this person's story. The Bible tells us we are saved by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony. No one can take away what God does for us. No one can argue with our own personal story. Jesus said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Cast out our lines, our testimony allows us to cast out our lines and catch the hearts of others. It shows God's grace and mercy are significant. Our story shows others God's mighty power. I pray this testimony encourages you with your own walk, that it helps you spring into action, that it helps you move into a deeper relationship with Christ and you feel compelled, even if it's to share your testimony with just one person, that you feel compelled to do it. Because in our weakness, he is our strength. That is God's promise to us. At the end of the testimony, we'll have open share groups. I encourage you to join our group and share a little of your own story during these times, how the testimony impacted you. Men are with men and women are with women. Feel free to comment in the section if you have a question, and our leaders will get back to you. I am so blessed to introduce this testimony to you and be able to stand forth with you. I love this woman, this tall, amazing bombshell of a blonde. She is so incredible, and God has worked in such a mighty way in her life. And I'm so excited for you guys to hear her story. And may you truly just allow God to move you into action. Without further ado, Lisa!
Good evening. That's a hard introduction to live up to. Hello, Venture family and friends. My name is Lisa, and I struggle with love and relationship addiction and food issues. Early on in my life, my parents divorced, and my father was awarded custody of me around the age of 1. My dad remarried a few years later to someone very broken who had some deep anger issues, which resulted in a very physically and emotionally and mentally abusive home life. Unfortunately, that increased substantially when my father committed suicide just before my 10th birthday. To escape from the trauma of suicide and abuse, I found food to numb my pain and comfort the empty hole in my heart that my dad had left. After a year or so, my stepmom decided it was time to put me on a diet. She tried them all. Whatever the latest fad was, I'd lose and gain back and forth as an 11 and 12-year-old. And by the time I hit junior high, I started taking diet pills to produce the results that she was wanting. By high school, I was either binging in the cafeteria or spending my lunch break running the track and not eating at all. I was never small enough or smart enough. My grades were average or below because my severe depression left me sleeping as much as possible as an escape. My stepmom's anger had escalated over the years, and with my dad gone, she had become much more abusive, verbally and physically, telling me horrific things about how I looked and that college would be a waste of money on me. There were doctor appointments canceled because the bruises hadn't healed, and days that I couldn't brush my hair from my head being beat up against the wall in her fits of rage. I began to write the suicide note that I would leave behind, and I planned an escape from my private hell. At this point, I believed I was not only unworthy, but unwanted and unlovable. A few years later, I married. We had 3 beautiful daughters who I was privileged to stay at home with, and also homeschool them for 15 years. I was married for 22 years when I divorced. I realize now that I had chosen someone with similar traits as my stepmom because subconsciously I wanted to recreate and accomplish in my marriage what I was unable to fix in my growing up years. I had become very unhappy and spent as much time away from being home as possible, volunteering for every church and homeschool event that came along to avoid slowing down and being still long enough to admit just how miserable I was in my own home. My home, the very place I had dreamed of making a sanctuary of respite for my family, I now avoided and focused on being a human doing instead of a human being. After my divorce 8 years ago, I hit the world of online dating. I was riddled with fear and shame, fear of rejection and shame of what I looked like. But I thought if I was able to find a man who found me attractive enough, then it would prove all those voices from my childhood wrong, that I was lovable, that I was enough. I made the same mistake over and over in my attempts to feel cherished and gave myself over too quickly in hopes that eventually one of these relationships would work out. But as each one died, I assumed it was something I did or didn't do, or that I wasn't enough, or that I was too much. I felt my weight was the reason for these failed relationships every single time. I hit rock bottom when I looked around and saw the depravity I had allowed myself to become a part of. Situations that escalated into circumstances where I relinquished my control, and in environments that were the dark, soul-destroying, and mind-numbing places reminiscent of my vision of hell. I knew I had to stop the insanity. This was not me. That's when God got my attention with Celebrate Recovery and said, enough. One of the first things I did after starting recovery was committing to God and myself to take a year off from dating and work on becoming the person that the man I was looking for is looking for. I knew my current way of life would not be appealing to the godly man he had in mind for me. I would love to stand here and tell you that I did it perfectly. No setbacks, no screw-ups, but I can't. Recovery is messy and totally imperfect, but it was in those times of failing that I learned the most about my addiction. I learned what my triggers were so I could stop something before it got a foothold. I also learned where the roots of this addiction came from and why it manifested this way in me. I came to see how my other struggle with food issues was closely entwined with my addiction for love and unhealthy relationships. Initially, I thought Celebrate Recovery was for those with chemical addictions. But after my first meeting, I realized only about a third of those were there for drugs and alcohol. The rest were there for things that we see and deal with every day: divorce, childhood trauma, pornography, anxiety, and poor body image, just to name a few. When I attended my first CR meeting, I explained to God exactly how this recovery thing was going to happen for me. I would show up at the meeting, but I wasn't going to say what my issues were out loud. I mean, really, I was raised in church. I was a Beth Moore studying, VBS teaching, homeschool mom. You don't admit that stuff out loud in church. But I did. And when I did, I felt the weight of shame and fear that had been binding my voice and weighing my soul down lift off me as I spoke out loud into existence and stripped away the power that had been holding me back in a prison of shame too deep to speak the truth until now. I had found a safe place to be real with what my struggles were instead of putting on my Sunday face so no one would know what was really going on. I had reached a point with my weight where I had lost all hope. Hope that I would someday feel comfortable in my own skin, that I could look at myself in a full-length mirror and feel something other than disgust, or go into public and not be consumed with worry about what people thought when they saw me. What would it be like to go to places and not feel so self-conscious about how I was being perceived by others? What would it be like to have friends tag me in photos on Facebook and not be so embarrassed by what I saw I would cry in humiliation later? I was canceling going out with friends because I didn't want to be seen. My shame was so overwhelming, I just wanted to stay hidden away. I told myself I don't deserve new clothes because of how I looked, and I was powerless to keep myself from numbing with food that had been my source of comfort since I was young, as I continued to perpetuate this vicious cycle. This played a big part in how I felt I was perceived by men as well. While I wanted to be found attractive, I really struggled to even imagine that someone would or could see me that way. I finally had to surrender and let God write my love story, not Christian Mingle. This is an ongoing process. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was driving through the mountains having a conversation with God, because that's where I can hear him the clearest. I was asking him about relationships. Will he lead me to make the right decisions? Will he clearly tell me when to walk away and when to stay? When I heard him loud and clear say, "My daughter, you're asking the wrong question. When will you give me your heart and allow me to hold it and guard it for you until I show you the man who has earned it?" Oh, there's that whole surrender thing you seem to be big on. But what if you don't do it right? Because I've done such a great job on my own, right? You can probably imagine the rest of the conversation. Okay, I'll surrender, but here's the list of requirements. You know, a verse that really stood out to me early on in my recovery journey was Romans 6:14, which says, "For sin shall no longer be your master, because you're not under the law." The hope and promise of not being a slave to my addictions anymore is what drew me to Celebrate Recovery. But I wanted to fully understand what that last line meant, so I dug deeper. What I learned was that the law in the Old Testament gave no means to empower or equip anyone to resist sin. It was only there to condemn the sinner. But because of what Jesus did for us by dying on the cross, because of that, we are under grace. And here it's talking about grace as the ability to call on Jesus to empower us through him to say no to sin. To when we finally admit we are powerless and unable to defeat sin in our own attempts, and that by submitting ourselves to him is when he can do the work for us. And that, my friends, that is the most beautiful picture of grace painted for each and every one of us. I learned in Celebrate Recovery that when I'm standing on a ledge, I have two choices. I can jump off that cliff back into the cycle of my addictions like I've been doing, or I can invite others into my cliff moment. Other prodigal sons and daughters like myself who struggle with what's trying to rule over them. I realize I am powerless to do any of this on my own. I tried for years in my own strength, willpower, and resolve, only to perpetuate the cycle downwards deeper and deeper because of the guilt of failing. It's taken many months, many meetings, for it to finally sink in for me. For me, sugar is my heroin. So often we look at chemical addiction differently, but addiction is still what rules the brain, and I know I have no power in myself to stop. I've realized my habits ingrained from childhood and my marriage of codependency are also an addiction. An addiction I'm confronting and relearning healthier responses to. I've also learned how my own lack of communication skills and my fear of making others angry led to my systematic shutting down and retreating, which I had to learn in childhood for self-preservation, but it left me unable to know how to respond effectively to my ex-husband as a voice for my children and I. Often I wanted to speak up for myself, but I didn't feel my voice had value to be heard, or that I even had a choice to speak my thoughts, my feelings, and my opinions. I wasn't raised to be able to share that way, so I never learned how to communicate in a healthy way until later in life. Recently, I underwent counseling for the horribly critical words said into me at a young age. It was incredibly freeing to have someone validate that the poisonous words I not only remembered hearing said, but continued to allow to cycle through my mind were not just untrue, but were being used by the enemy to keep me from seeing the truth of who I am in Christ. I realized that I had allowed those critical, defeating, and demoralizing things said over me to create a critical, judgmental spirit within myself. I'm in the process of learning to take those critical thoughts captive and not allowing them room to roam anymore. I'm done being the victim of my childhood, and from here on out, I claim to be the victor instead. I am a beloved child of the King, a prodigal daughter free from shame who has a Father who is relentless in the pursuit of my heart. He sees things in me I never knew existed. And I'm realizing not only did he die for my sin, but he died to free me from the shame that defined my life. Isaiah 61:7 says, "Instead of your shame, there shall be a double portion. Instead of dishonor, they shall rejoice in their lot. Therefore, in their land they shall possess a double portion, and they shall have everlasting joy." God has reminded me these last few years in recovery that he had planted a seed of ministry in me long ago. As I began to give back as part of my recovery by being the training coach here at Venture Church's Celebrate Recovery, it has improved my writing, speaking, and leadership skills. And I'm excited to say I'm back at school at Northwest University working on my bachelor's in ministry and my credentials as a pastor through Venture. He's yearning to do the same for you. If you will just surrender yourself to the embrace he is running out to give you when you take that first step forward. I beg you to hear this if you have heard nothing else. There is no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus. Don't allow your past to define your future. The future that Jeremiah 29:11 reminds us that God knows the plans that he has for you. Plans to prosper you, not to harm you. Plans to give you a hope and you a future. I know my recovery is not a destination, it's a journey where I continue to work through daily, sometimes hourly, offering my body as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, because this is my true and proper worship to him. Thank you for letting me share with you tonight.
Oh my goodness. Venture family, Celebrate Recovery family. That was incredible. That was incredible. I've given my testimony before, you guys, and I just encourage you to drop some comments. Tell Lisa. She said, I usually look out at people and I hear the laughs. You can do that. You can do that right now in the comments for her. Give her some encouragement, you guys. Giving your testimony, if you haven't done it, is one of the most scariest things in the world, but it gives God so much glory. He gets the glory, you guys. I just pray right now that as you heard that testimony, that chains are falling. We're not alone in this walk. You guys, I'm not sure what you're struggling with, what you're trying to process through, what you're working through, but you can't do it alone. Our Celebrate Recovery is about to open up the doors again, definitely with social distancing on July 6th. I encourage you, if you haven't checked out one of our meetings in person, that you do so. You can start by joining a small group tonight. In the comments, we will have the codes for you to join. Once again, men with men and women with women, and we separate those groups. We have codependency groups, we have open share, we have substance abuse and love and relationships, all different for men with men and women with women. As I said, you guys, I can't encourage you enough that during these times, we all need recovery and to surrender our lives to Christ so that he can be the author and the perfecter of our faith and our testimony so that we can share it with others. I just pray that you do that and that there's no longer fear. Because as we stand firm in our faith during these times, we can be the light that the world needs to see. I just pray that as you go into these small groups, that you can just share, even if it's a tiny bit of your testimony with somebody else, that you can see the encouragement that you can feel personally from Christ as you share it. Maybe it's something you've never told anybody before. Maybe it's something that you've held on to. I just pray that hearing Lisa's testimony and all the incredible things that God has done in her life, that it encourages you to grow deeper in your relationship with Christ. I don't know if you're a leader. I don't know if you're a churchgoer consistently and during these times you've fallen aside or you've chosen to just question, where is God in all of this? He's there. He's real and he's ready, waiting with open arms to embrace you. I just encourage you this week that you just dive in deep with him, that you recognize that you're not alone, that you call somebody, you reach out to somebody, you recognize that as places are opening up and that you don't have to lead with fear, but you can step out in faith and in truth and know that you are not alone. I know with my testimony that I felt incredibly alone. When I was going through a vicious divorce, I did not have hope. I couldn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. I walked into Celebrate Recovery. Actually, I walked into a step study group, not knowing what Celebrate Recovery was. I probably would have thought I was too good for it. But now I have to say that it's part of who I am. I'm a misfit and I need my people. I just encourage you to come and join us. Be welcomed and embraced. Find your place and get the tools that God has for you to process and work through some of the issues that have surfaced. I just thank you for allowing us to come today, and we just pray for your week in Jesus' name. Thanks.